Okay. Oh, cool. So it just automatically starts recording. Great. And then there's people are coming in. So welcome people who are coming in. We're just kind of talking. So we'll get started in a few minutes, but we were just talking about the Johns Hopkins science writing program. There's a master's, an MA in science writing that you can get through Johns Hopkins, which I am currently in my last semester of. So two of our panelists are teachers in the Johns Hopkins either writing or science writing program there. So you were just talking about how Johns Hopkins is a really great program. So a little free advertisement there. I'm not getting paid.
Nancy, you teach in the science writing?
I teach in the science writing program. Yes, I have for about six years. I'm teaching narrative science writing right now.
Okay.
The course.
Appropriate for this topic.
Yes, I think that's why Rachel invited me.
Mhm.
She knew I was doing that.
I'm in the general writing program, but 14 of my 15 students in one class this semester are in the science writing program. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I took Wayne's digital storytelling and multimedia class.
Journalism. Yeah.
Journalism, yeah, which was amazing. It was excellent. So,
Good. Glad to hear that.
mhm.
Also not paid.
Right. Yes.
Doing there.
So we got about
Got a good crowd.
39 people right now. So we'll let people kind of trickle in a little bit more. Yes. So yeah.
Rachel, where are you calling in from?
I live
Funny
in
person here.
Bowie, Maryland right now.
Oh.
So which is about 30 minutes northeast, if I get my directions right, of DC, about, depending on traffic if you're driving. So
Is it anywhere near the one single thing I know about Maryland, which is Atomic Books?
what?
You ever go to Atomic Bookstore?
Atomic Books, no.
Presumably in Baltimore. If you want to send John Waters fan mail, you just drop it off at the store.
Oh,
And he
okay.
goes in to pick it up every
Oh.
Sunday or something.
Really?
Well,
No, that's
he's one of
good.
the most prestigious Johns Hopkins graduates.
Oh, was he a graduate of Johns Hopkins? Wow.
Yes.
Okay, I do have Atomic Books saved on my places to go. So I apparently did hear of it at one point. So Baltimore is about 45 minutes away from me.
Mm.
Okay. I'd like to know if John Waters was a science writing graduate.
I somehow doubt that.
Yeah. Somehow it also seems like it would be appropriate. I'm not sure why.
Okay, well, I think that we should go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome to Telling the Best Stories in Science, brought to you by the DC Science Writers Association, also lovingly known as DUXWA. My name is Rachel Lenz, and I will be your moderator this evening. Helping me out tonight with questions is Michael Newman. He is one of DUXWA's social events chairs. Now, before we get started, we put together a quick poll for you, our audience, consisting of two questions to see where you are or how you heard about this event. We'll leave the poll up for a minute or two so everyone can answer. It just helps us out so we know where to concentrate our marketing efforts in the future. So let's see. There. Can you see that? Cool. So I'll just leave that up for a little bit. And then there's one last bit of business before we dive into our conversation. You may be used to normal Zoom calls where you can see everyone and type in a chat box, but here you don't have that option. In order to accommodate everyone, this is a Zoom webinar, so chats are automatically disabled. You can only see panelists and hosts. If you have questions throughout our conversation, feel free to pop them into the Q&A tab. We will be leaving time at the end of the session for our panelists to address audience questions. So now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's introduce our fabulous panelists. Sumant Prabhakar is the editor of Orion, an environmental magazine, which recently celebrated its 40th anniversary. He is also the founder of two nonprofit literary organizations, Madras Press, a charitable publisher whose catalog includes work by Donald Bartlemy, Lydia Davis, and David Foster Wallace, and Migrant Books, a pop-up bookstore for international children's literature. He holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where he was an editor for the journal Ecotone. He lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. Nancy Lord is an Alaska resident and former Alaska Writer Laureate. She is the author or editor of 10 books related to northern subjects and the environment. She's addressed the climate crisis in her narrative nonfiction book, Early Warming, Crisis and Response in the Climate Change North, and her novel, pH. She is a former commercial salmon fisherman and currently teaches science and medical writing for Johns Hopkins University. Her MFA degree is from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her website is writernancylord.com. Wayne Curtis is the author of And a Bottle of Rum, A History of the New World in 10 Cocktails, and The Last Great Walk, the true story of a 1909 walk from New York to San Francisco and why it matters today. He's written for dozens of publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, American Archaeology, Preservation, and The Smart Set. He writes frequently about travel, history, cocktails, and spirits. He's been a columnist for The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, The American Scholar, and The Smart Set. And he currently writes columns for Garden and Gun and Imbibe. He teaches nonfiction techniques at the Master's in Writing program at Johns Hopkins University and lives mostly in New Orleans, but also sometimes in Maine. Shane M. Hanlon, PhD, is an executive producer and co-host of the American Geophysical Union's podcast, Third Pod from the Sun. A conservation biologist turned science communicator. He is also manager of AGU's Sharing Science program, where he teaches fellow scientists how to communicate effectively. He also is a senior producer with The Story Collider. You can find him on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Ecology of Shane. So, okay. That was a lot. I need to take a drink of water. But let's kick things off with what may or may not be a simple question. What is a story? Who wants to start with their definition?
Nancy, jump
I'll
right in.
Because I was trained in fiction writing, which has a very kind of a clear definition of story. And often when we talk about, often when writers talk about stories, they mean fiction sort of by default. But the classic definition is a narrative that has an arc. Something happens and some kind of climax and resolution. And I've kind of stuck with that in nonfiction writing too. So that's kind of how I think of what makes a story.
I'd agree with that and say it happens across time. So it's not a snapshot, it's not fixed. It happens like it's a narrative and it reaches a resolution, and the resolution has something for the reader or listener or viewer to take away with them, some sort of a not necessarily a lesson, but something that sticks in their mind.
And I think something important too that we always stress, and I guess we in the many things that I do story wise, but stories have change. There's always some sort of thing that happens, and the protagonist, whoever it might be, is changed at the end. A story without change is an anecdote. Anecdotes are fine. Anecdotes are great. They are really effective in communicating something or another. But stories have change, and so that's one of the big things that I'm always focusing on when thinking about what makes up a story.
It's, I mean, all of these are brilliant and true, and it's hard to imagine modifying any of these, very true sounding definitions. The only thing I'll add is we at Orion, we put out a call for pitches a couple times a year to get to get some new writers in the doors. And we have a test within the editorial office that we refer to as like the dinner party test, which is, would you if you were seated at a table at a dinner party next to a stranger, would you nudge your neighbor with your elbow and be like, I like, let me tell you this story. Like, I have this amazing story I need to tell you. And I know I'm sort of graduating the answer from what is a story to like, what is a compelling story? But that is a very common rubric for us as well.
I think you may have actually answered one of my questions I had for you later. Dang it. But
Sorry.
maybe we'll revisit it. Okay, I think that's good. And it actually kind of gets me to the next question I had, which is, I feel like a lot of people think of stories as like silly kid things or something to, you just partake in on the weekends. Do you think that assumption is true, or do you think stories are more important to society?
I'll kick in on that one. It strikes me as, not just me, but a lot of people who studied them, that stories are how we learn. It's evolutionarily where those that could process and understand and remember and convey and relate stories are the ones who are succeeded in a society where we are dependent on others to advance and progress. And the society, before the printing press, before the internet, before all that, you communicated with stories. And I think that's why if you're in a crowd and you overhear somebody say, and you won't believe what happened, you stop and you listen, because we're just programmed genetically for that. We listen to found out what happened. It may not be our exact circumstance, but we want to know what happened, because that's how we've learned to survive, by listening to how others have survived in different circumstances. And like Shane said, there's change involved, often unexpected change. And you want to know, how did this person, whether it's fictional or non-fictional, deal with the change? And what can I learn from that, so that when I'm in a situation that might have analogies or parallels to that, I know how to survive. So I think it's not something you just do on weekends. It's deeply, deeply ingrained in us for survival.
I was speaking with a friend who works at ProPublica, and she was talking about the story she'd been working on for like more than a year, like 14, 15 months. And it's not going to sound very groundbreaking, because a lot of their work is sort of reinforcing stuff that already exists kind of as a cultural hunch. But so there was a town in West Virginia, and it was on some waterfront, and some company like DuPont or something opened a manufacturer there. And everybody in the town was healthy, and then the plant opened, and suddenly the water turned red, and there was yellow dust on the ground, and everybody got sick. And then there were protests, and then the plant shut down, and then everybody was healthy again. And like, she researches the hell out of it. There's, like inarguable data that you could put on a plate, and yet nothing happens. Zero sanctions are made. Like, everything just kind of, life moves on. And then This American Life picks up like a 4.5-minute segment covering the story, and like 24 hours later, there's congressional people testifying about it. There's people being subpoenaed. Like, there is something very necessary about the emotional urgency that I think a narrative affords to data sets that we already know, but don't necessarily know how to prioritize in terms of what we allow ourselves to respond to as citizens. The story is able to sort of compete with other narratives that are floating around for our attention, for our compassion. And so that's maybe that's the more cumbersome way of putting it, not quite as sophisticated as Wayne did, but similarly so.
Well, I think it's important for us to realize that even if we're not deliberately thinking about story, we tell stories every day, literally every day. Most of human history has been passed down via story. The fact that we are being deliberate about calling a thing a story and using that as kind of a technique or educational tool, that's relatively new, specifically kind of in Western culture, right? Like we've been doing this as people forever. So even if we don't deliberately go out and say, yes, here's a story that I'm going to tell you. How was your weekend? That's a story. Like, what were you up to today? That's a story. Like, we are constantly doing this anyways. And so again, it's manufactured for a question, but we are doing this all the time. And so even if we don't quite realize it, it's a part of who we are. It's a part of how we communicate in our everyday lives.
Yeah, I would just mention a book by Vivian Gornick called The Situation and the Story, which makes a distinction between a situation, which is, there's something, and then the story is the meaning that comes out of the situation. And I'd like to think of it that way, that stories really, the best ones should drive some kind of action, or at least action within our brains, some realization and awakening and awareness, and potentially something even more profound.
There's not a chat here. I can't drop a link in, but Rachel, you might remember that one of the stories I had you read was from the Harvard Business Review. It's recapping some studies from people that were measuring what went on in your brain when you heard stories, and they found marked raise in levels of the oxytocin that sort of when you hear a story, you respond physiologically to it. You don't ever, it's not a choice to listen to it. You want to listen to it because your body is flooding you with this hormone that gives you pleasure. And so you want to hear more stories. It's some fascinating science on story. And there's a book by a guy named Will Shore called The Science of Storytelling. And he delves into this quite a bit too, sort of the physiological and evolutionary aspects of storytelling.
I'll find it. I was just thinking about that actually. Yeah, it's taking the logical and then mixing it with the emotional to bring it and make it personal.
So then, I mean, like going back to like cave art times, would that be like what you think of as like the earliest form of storytelling? In like this whole concept of like the evolutionary utility of it is really novel to me and really fascinating, and it's something I know like zero about. I mean, where does that, in terms of like our evolutionary timeline, how much of what's that milestone to you?
I'm not sure about the cave art. I'm not sure where that would fit into it, whether that's representation or storytelling. I imagine there's education in that cave art, telling how to go after a bison or whatever it was, mammoths, whatever they were taking down there. Yeah, imagine that's part of it. It's part of the drive to pass on that information and as a visual story.
I know like oral storytelling goes, far beyond the written word. That's about as much as I know about that. I just pasted the Harvard Business Review article that Wayne mentioned in the chat for everybody.
Great.
And I think, Yeah, the book Science of Storytelling is the other one that I mentioned. It's well worth tracking down. And I think it's fairly new, maybe 2 or 3 years old. It's got a lot of good information on all this and touches on some of the evolutionary stuff with that as storytelling as a survival skill.
Wayne, in the class that I took from you, the digital storytelling and multimedia journalism class, you talk a lot about the building blocks of a story. There must be a beginning, a middle, and an end. There must be some inciting incident that sparks the beginning of the story. And there must be change. I think one of the other panelists mentioned this, both for the main character, whoever or whatever it is, as well as within each scene. This was one of the pieces in your class that really surprised me, or I really took heart with this. Can you talk a little bit more about dramatic tension and the but therefore rule of storytelling?
Yeah, that comes from South Park creators that gave that. I think I had you watch the video that they spoke of, which is that they say if their scenes are connected by and then, so the scene ends and then another scene happens, then that's a failure. You need a but or a therefore to connect your scenes, to keep the tension going throughout. So something happens, but this then happens. So it progresses onward for that. Or something happens, therefore, whatever just happened causes the next scene to happen. But if you're just having one scene and then another scene and then another scene, you're not doing it right. You've got to have that sort of tension going on in it. And there's, I think it's John McKee who writes a lot about story, talks about a positive scene should end with a negative, or a negative scene should end with a positive. So if you start something out with everything's going well for your protagonist, maybe it's a research scientist trying to figure out some genetic code issue. By the end of that scene, which might be a page or two, you should probably end with a negative, that something's gone wrong, and then you start the next scene just to keep the tension up. And you can start with a negative, end with a positive, maybe start with a negative and end with a double negative. Things are really going bad for a protagonist. But keeping it, it's just it's not a formula, it's not an algorithm, but it's a great tool when you're writing a piece. When you get that first draft done, to step back and just look at the scene and ask yourself, is this an and then, or a but therefore? And but therefore, or is it, what's the polarity here? Is it negative followed by a positive or not? It's just a helpful tool to help you analyze what's happening in a scene, I think. I don't know if others have found other tools that are helpful for analyzing how the story is unfolding in a piece.
I mean, that's really fascinating. And in terms of storytellers, that's a pretty high authority to cite. The way that we think about it at Orion is maybe similar in sentiment, but without quite as articulate of a vocabulary. I had a chance to interview a comic artist named Chris Ware a couple of years ago,
Oh, yeah.
who's a pretty looming figure in my own library. And one of the things that I was really excited to ask him about was this tendency that he has in his work to alternate the background colors behind his panels periodically over the course of a graphic novel. Like, it'll be like 20 pages of red behind the panels and then like 20 pages of blue or something. And there's very little correlation between the background and what's happening in the actual story. So it's not like it's nighttime, so it's a black or dark blue background or something. So you knew that there was a sense of, there was something very calculated happening, but it was difficult for me to really put my finger on it. And so I asked him about it, and he says, the first thing that you learn in art school is the way that the colors affect the rods and cones in your eyes. And like, for instance, the way that pale green changes your eye when you're like immersed in it for a very long time, is that when you shift from that to pale blue, the blue looks pink. The green does something to set your eyes up to turn the blue momentarily kind of rosy. And and he was just like, every page that you put down is preparing you for whatever's going to come next, and will necessarily color whatever comes next. And I think about that with great horror and embarrassment when I think about the sort of whimsy that often determines the storytelling that we do on our less professional days, when we're like, hey, here's a cute picture of a baby tiger, let's just put it in and move on. On our best days, we're thinking very holistically about the way in which one scene or one physical page will be an entry point into the next one, or will modify the next one, or prepare people for the next one, sort of. So I agree with that sense of tension being really necessary in terms of sustaining the momentum that's needed to keep going through a narrative.
Can you spell that comic artist's name?
Oh, it's Ware. It's his last name, Chris Ware. You'll all know him from his New Yorker covers the moment
Okay.
you look him up.
Okay, thank you.
Didn't he do a book on basically how to be a cartoonist? Was that somebody else I'm thinking of?
He contributed to one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rachel, in terms of your question about dramatic tension in science writing, because it's not always obvious that there is some. So a technique that I like to rely on is to make sure that in the beginning of the story that it's clear what the question is, that there's some sort of question that's going to ultimately find an answer or something. And it may even be phrased as a question, but at least it's introduced as some sort of something that's going to have the writer be thinking that there's something to be discovered as the reading continues. Something unexpected, probably.
Actually, Nancy, I do have a question for you. Since you've written both narrative nonfiction as well as fiction, and your book PH is still very much about science and the environment, are there aspects from this type of writing, fiction or narrative nonfiction, that can be applied to, say, straight journalism, or for someone who struggles writing like captivating pieces for like a university or something?
I guess I would have to say yes. I'm not sure what, but it just goes back to storytelling. I think that any storytelling can be used in journalism. Certainly lots of journalism involves storytelling. I mean, I think the best of it does. And I read a lot of the science related pieces in the New Yorker, and, writers like Elizabeth Colbert. It's very narrative. And it's very similar to what I would in my world call, creative nonfiction. It's nonfiction writing, but it uses a lot of techniques of, scene setting and attention to language and, all the things that we do when we think we're writing creatively.
Yeah, that's one of the points I like to make in the nonfiction techniques class. I have people read some New Yorker stories, no matter what the New Yorker's writing about, whether it's climate change or tectonics or forestry, it's always about a person. There's a person who represents whatever is happening there. And they start with a person, and that person, it's usually an inciting incident of some sort. And then they're on a quest, and you sort of follow with them. It's sort of all of them are. The New Yorker's got a really good classic story format, no matter what it's writing about. At the end, you might know a lot about plate tectonics, but when you started out, you're just curious about this scientist who had a theory that no one believed, and what he was up against. See, those classic building blocks of a story: protagonist striving to reach a goal and facing obstacles. If you've got that, and science, I think science writing is so great to read because there's so much of that, the classic building blocks in science writing. So many people have theories that are being questioned, or theories that are that everyone assumes are correct, but somebody else has figured out they're not. And that's classic storytelling right there.
I especially like the kind of storytelling that the New Yorker uses a lot too, and Elizabeth Colbert, who I just mentioned. I'm thinking of a story of hers where she goes with scientists into a bat cave and describes the white nose syndrome that the bats have and everything. But it's very immersive on the part of the writer who's part of the story, and that's just really compelling to me. And I mean, I try to do that too to some degree. I mean, I love hanging out with scientists and being with them when they're doing their work, and I got to do a fair amount of that with different biologists.
So would you say some advice would be like finding a way to make your story character driven?
Never hurts. If you find the right character,
Yeah,
it can be a problem sometimes.
Right.
but
yeah,
But
I
people want to read about other people. They don't want to read about ideas.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking for like trying to give like specific advice to people.
Yeah. Look for people who can carry the idea, particularly interesting people.
Yeah. And if you don't have a person, maybe try to characterize an idea.
That helps.
Shane, you were like nodding your head enthusiastically when Wayne was talking about a person. It seemed like you had something to add.
Yeah, I mean, my business. So I'm an audio storyteller. So I'm not a science writer. Full disclosure, I do it through multiple means, but it's always person driven. I mean, we even so I run a podcast, and we do these kind of mini series that are around scientific themes that are pretty broad. It's fire and ice and extinctions and that type of thing. It's all driven around the person because we're not a super highly produced thing like Radio Lab where you mainly hear from producers. It's mainly from the person, the interviewee, the person that we're actually talking to. And so that person, yeah, it needs to be engaging, which is especially tricky in a format where you are literally hearing directly from the source. But that's what people care about. But it's an interesting mix of framing because we've done some things where it's, hey, here's this person that does this thing. And listeners go, I mean, we don't know who that person is. And then you go, oh, here's this really interesting thing. And then the subtext is you're going to actually hear from the person, and folks seem to latch onto that. So I think, and this is for audio, obviously, but I think framing is super important as well. And not that we're trying to go out there and trick people into reading or listening to something they're not quite aware of, but part of the story is also how we frame the story and how we actually get people interested in the thing, whether that's a written piece or an audio or visual or whatever it might be. And so having good content is obviously very, very important, but also how we're messaging that content is incredibly important as well. Going from being a researcher to a communicator to whatever I am right now, I've done more marketing in my life than I ever thought I would have to do. I did not plan for it, but like kind of in some ways being our own like PR folks, essentially, depending on what your job is, has also become kind of like a really important thing, or at least at the very least, knowing what's a good, especially in written things, like what's a good headline, what's going to be the hook, what's going to be the first few words, the first few sentences that are going to reel that audience in, can be sometimes just as important as the story itself, because if folks aren't interested in those first few seconds or their first few lines or whatever it might be, then they're not going to engage. And so the whole story is the payoff, but that little bit in the beginning can also be really important as well.
Yeah, I know that's kind of hammered home in the Johns Hopkins program, is like the first sentence and the last sentence are kind of like the most important.
And it's honestly, and again, not to say the body's not important, because that's very true. It's very important. But folks, the take home is folks remember beginnings and ends that change. They might not remember like all the specific details in the middle, but that's really important to make sure that they know what the whole story is, obviously. But yeah, how you start, how you end, what's that change arc? Like those are the big things. And so finding those out, making sure that at the end of a story, when you ask someone, what did you take away from that? those are probably the things that they're initially going to hone in on.
Mm. Shane, I actually have a question for you related to the two podcasts that you work on. So you work on the Story Collider and AGU's Third Pod from the Sun. Third Pod from the Sun, I know that you mentioned it's not like super highly produced like Radiolab, but you know it has some music and some sound effects. Whereas the Story Collider that's more like the Moth, where it's a recording of somebody getting up in front of a live audience and delivering a story to a live audience. Can you talk to us about some of the different tactics involved in telling a story effectively to a live audience versus just on a podcast?
Yeah, and frankly, just to be sure, we have different audiences. So AGU, Third Pod from the Sun's my day job. Story Collider is a loving side project that I am part of that is much larger than myself. For AGU, for Third Pod, it's more science-y, to be kind of generic about it. It's more research focused. We are definitely looking to bring in a non-science audience to communicate in terms that folks understand, but we're talking about research. We're talking about the field experiences and lab things and the stories behind the science. And so there's a little bit more explanation there. There's a little bit more, here's like a science thing that we're trying to produce for a broad audience. Story Collider's different. The goal of Story Collider to show that everyone has a story, regardless of whether they're a scientist or not. Science surrounds all of us. It's part of all of our lives, independent of whether we think it is or not. And so with Story Collider, we're trying to really humanize and tell those personal, sometimes really funny and light stories, sometimes deeply personal and very heavy stories about how science has affected our lives. And so with Story Collider, folks who tell stories are scientists, and then sometimes they've never thought about science since they had to take a science class in 8th grade. But the idea is that science is part of all of our lives. And so for me, it's helpful that they complement one another, but the goals and the audiences are a little bit different, a lot different perhaps. And Story Collider is really fun because it's a live thing for the most part as well. We do live shows for me here in DC with my colleague, Miriam Zaringhalam. And so that's more of a performance. Anyone can talk about science. Everyone is affected by science, where Third Pod is, here's a research thing that's really fascinating and fun that folks might be interested in. So yeah, complement one another, but the goals, audiences, everything is a little bit different.
Are there like techniques in delivery like that is important for a live audience? So like when somebody's getting up there and they're telling a story, do you have to like coach them in a certain way that's different than on a podcast?
Yeah, there's a lot more. So there's more production with Third Pod, which is the more research side of things. So we just interview someone, then we can do a lot more moving around and a lot more stuff post-production. Story Collider, we go through literal months of training with storytellers. So when they get on stage, they can tell the best version of their story possible because there is no post-production. The story they tell is the story that gets up on the podcast. It's a story that everyone hears. So it's a lot more what we were talking about before about story arc and change, and a lot more of coaching someone to tell a story. So it's probably more of like what we're talking about when we're talking about storytelling techniques is more of the Story Collider approach, where yeah, Third Pod, like we're cheating. That's fine. That works for what we're doing, but we can arrange the story afterwards, which we cannot do with Story Collider.
Yeah. Let's see. Does anybody have experience with like video stories? Because I know that there's like different techniques for telling a story in video or like multimedia versus like podcasts or like orally or the written word. So.
In my class, I tend to focus more on what's shared rather than what's different, which is the same basic elements: protagonist, goal, obstacle. And I think it's just the language is different with video or than with print, but it's still the same building blocks there. There you set up what the goal is using visuals or a scene or two, as opposed to a paragraph or two, where you might be a little more expository, and video might be a little more suggestive, and then raises the questions that you try to answer further down the line. So it's not, I'm not an experienced video story producer. I dabble in that. I dabble in audio. I'm more experienced with print, but I tend to emphasize what's similar rather than what's different with the two. I don't know if others have experience with video and have taken a different approach.
I don't have anything to add about video, but one note of interest that we're sort of wrestling with as a magazine as we think about growing into the audio space, because of course what the world needs is yet another podcast. So you know, we're just kind of slowly percolating a couple ideas, and one thing that's been really interesting is to think about narrative expectations for consumers of media, as in terms of the tactile experience that they have with the paper or computer or phone or earbuds. You know, with podcasts largely being something that happens simultaneous to some other activity, whether it's driving or washing the dishes or whatever, the podcast tends to hold a little bit more control over the air, I feel. Whereas reading something with your eyes, you're always in competition with like 1,000 other things, because your thumb is like a half a millimeter away from clicking away. And so there's a little bit more sort of desperate anxiety, I think. And I think it's why you hear silence on podcasts in a way that it would be very difficult to replicate on the page. That podcasts have that ability to control time. And it's just logistically much harder to click away from what you're listening to while your hands are wet, while you're doing the dishes or whatever, than it is to you know, be in the middle of something and think, you know, I'd rather do a crossword puzzle right now, and put your magazine away and do something a little bit more fun and easy. And so it's easy often to think of the transition from print to audio being purely literal, but I think it's a much it's a fairly different experience that requires a bit of translation in order to really take advantage of the opportunities that they both present.
And the only thing I was going to say briefly with video, because I do have a smidge of experience in this, the technical difference I know of is storyboarding is really important with video, especially with video. We do it with podcasting, with audio, but storyboarding is so important. This idea, it's like, if folks are not familiar, you set out shot for shot, scene for scene, exactly what you're trying to tell with each individual shot, mainly because video is the culmination of everything. It is written, it is audio, it is visual, it's all of these things, and just doing it is really intensive. And so having the prep for video is, I'm not going to say it's uniquely intensive, but there's a lot to do with it. So before you even, or let's say, like I've even set out to do anything, the prep for it, making sure I know exactly what the story is. With podcasting, sometimes like we do our best to craft the story beforehand, but sometimes we're doing it the opposite way. Video, that's much more difficult. So storyboarding ahead of time is so very important to know the story you're trying to tell before you get the technical elements, just because it is so oftentimes so labor intensive.
That's a good point. Samantha, I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions about Orion specifically. So since storytelling is such an integral part of Orion, you have such a unique position as an editor. So all the rest of the panelists are, you know, they're more producing stories themselves, but you are an editor. What do you look for in any individual story to know it's worthy of your magazine? This is where I said that I think you've kind of answered already, but I'll leave that to you.
Well, it's never about worthy. It's always about, are we justifying the space that we're taking up in people's homes? The big difference, you know, between a magazine and a book is that with a book, there's the assumption that somebody has gone out of their way to find it. They've gone to the bookstore, they've gone to, Amazon or bookshop.org and bought it. And so they have invited this thing into their lives, and they've preemptively set aside space in their mind to accommodate it. Whereas a magazine is just a thing that shows up in the mail. And so there's a great deal of anxiety around like we promise we're not going to get mud on your carpet, like we're going to be polite house guests, and so all of the work is in service of that gentle introduction into people's homes, and just how do we package things in a way that make it worth doing this instead of folding laundry. So, I mean, the way that decision making happens is usually dictated by the theme of a particular issue. The issues are themed in order to just make it a little bit easier for people to know what's in store for them. They can look at the cover. I don't know if any of you do this, but like I often will, I'll buy a book and I'll know it's going to be great, and I'll know it'll be like an amazing reading experience, but I just feel like it's not the right time of life for me, and it'll just sit there on my bookshelf for like a year and a half or something. I do this with like Ishiguro, for instance, who's the most important author in my life. I'll buy his new book at like midnight when it comes out, and then I'll open it and I'll read a paragraph and I'll be like, I'm not ready for this. I'm just gonna wait. And so I like the thought of the magazine being something on the coffee table that people sort of eye suspiciously as they pass back and forth throughout their homes doing more important work. And every time they kind of catch a glimpse of a word on the cover that kind of, nudges them like, hey, if you're interested in this topic, like, take a few minutes or whatever. And so with the themes being really important to the architecture of the issues, all of the editorial work is simply, how do we turn this into a coherent conversation about this topic? What is the point of Orion entering a conversation about like fairy tales for our an issue we're doing next year, the ecology of fairy tales? What possibly could a reading of fairy tales do to enrich the life of the modern naturalist? And so that breaks out into several categories, like an idea-driven essay, an investigative piece or an activist piece, a memoir, a piece of criticism. We have certain slugs that we need to hit over the course of an issue. And then it's really just about balance. Like it's, have we featured something very lyrical in a while? Have we featured something that's extremely blunt and going to just like bludgeon you over the head with its ferocity of emotions? Have we done something very intellectually challenging? Just making sure that we strike the right balance that feels like the kind of cocktail that people expect from the magazine. And so, we pass on so much work that's incredible just in terms of pure merit, simply because what we're waiting for is more of a utilitarian workhorse to fulfill a certain need that will help to round out the ideal reading experience.
Interesting. So your every issue has a theme. Would you say that every issue also has a story to it? Like when you put it together, does it have like
Hopefully. Yeah, hopefully. I mean, not always. Sometimes the themes are more demographic, so it'll be a little more open-ended. Like we're going to do an issue about works in translation in the spring, and so I, being monolingual, have very little authority to say this is the this is like the reason why language is important to your understanding of the natural world or something like that. So instead, we're just kind of handing the keys to the car over and letting writers of a certain demographic kind of drive us wherever they want to. And we sort of create an open-ended space for that. but most of the time when it's a topical theme, when it's like hospitals or fairy tales or like an issue we're doing about hip hop and nature in a couple of years, there is a definite emotional narrative that is extremely important. I really get frustrated with magazines and journals. This is more of a journal thing to do, where they just announce their theme with one word on the cover and that's it. And it'll say, this is our issue about shame or fear or whatever. Because I have like my kids' lunches to pack, you know what I mean? Like I have things to do and you're not really, like there's very little sense of like, what's the point? Outside of my graduate school days when I had when it was I don't know, my goal in life to grow intellectually or whatever, outside of that brief window, it's very hard to imagine a scenario where I'm like, sure, I'm up for reading about shame, like let's do it, you know. And so I really look to like Martha Stewart Living for inspiration, actually, because those covers will say like, make your bed in a certain way and it will make your life worth living. It will be like, make your bed in a certain way and it will be the cure to suicide for like 48 hours. And there's something so transactional and like beautifully personal about that. And I really love the promise that like this literature, these stories are going to slightly make sense of the chaos that's before you. And the more that we can do to say like, if you read our perception, our retelling of fairy tales, maybe when you put the book down, like things will be a little less scary for you. And the more that we can do to announce what is the promise or the hope, at least, of that overarching narrative, I think the more likely people are to put their laundry aside for it, you know.
I love that.
The two themes that you just mentioned, hip hop and nature and the ecology of fairy tales, I'm already intrigued.
Yeah.
It's definitely a step of, those are both sort of stories in a nutshell. They're
Yeah.
just waiting to be
Oh, yeah.
told. So those are great.
If anybody is not a subscriber to Orion, you should become one because it is a great magazine and I'm not getting paid again. So. Okay, so I think that we're 10 minutes to the hour. Let's start going through some of the questions that we've gotten. See, this is from David Shapiro. If a story involves change, can it be past change? I'm thinking of stories, maybe you just call them anecdotes that say, here's what I ran into, here's the story of how I dealt with it, and here's the lesson, maxim, learning I brought in from past experience that guided me to deal with this. Perhaps there isn't enough of a discovery arc, so you'd call these anecdotes.
I think and that is really the framing, because we start off, what are you looking for? What's your quest? What are you seeking? And then everything else falls into place underneath that. So I think that is the change that you can have in there. Presumably, he was looking for something in that story arc, and there's been change within that. So I think he could work that. And it seems to be all in the framing.
Yeah, David, I think you're selling yourself short here. Like, here's what I ran into, here's the story of how I dealt with it, and here's the lesson that I brought in from past experience. Maybe the third part could be a little bit heavy-handed if it's not held artfully. But like, here's the story of how I dealt with this thing. Is, I don't know, I'm having a hard time imagining a different framing for a short story or essay that I've ever read in my life. I think you're doing the exact thing that you want to be doing here.
Oh, go ahead, Nancy.
Oh, I was just going to say, I like to think about writing about the past as in memoir, using multiple voices. There's sort of what my friend Sue Silverman calls the voice of innocence and the voice of experience. So you can kind of tell the story of what happened in the past and then reflect upon it in the present in a kind of a multi-layered story. So I'm just saying it's all in the framing. I agree with that. how you put it together.
Yeah, and the only thing I was going to add is we haven't talked about stakes, but something I hear a lot when, especially with personal stories, is that I have a story, but it's not literally life or death. Will people be interested about? And that's stakes. Like, what are the actual stakes of a story? And if it's important to you, especially with personal stories, you can make it important to everyone else. We've done stories as a story collider. We've done stories that are literal life and death that have those type of stakes, but also I sent out this email that I was worried that was going to get me fired. And like, those are big stakes, but not quite as big. But if you make it important to you, the audience, whoever your intended audience, will come along with you. So something also that we tell folks, and I personally have to deal with as well, like, just because you might not think it's literally life or death, if it matters to you, you can make it matter to the folks that whoever your intended audience is.
One of my favorite stories on This American Life was about the producer was standing in the subway, and he was watching this sort of crazy guy walk down the corridor or down the tunnel, and he would go up to everybody that he encountered and whisper something in their ear and then move on, and slowly shuffling his way towards the producer. And so there's this initial part of the story where he's like, what's this guy talking about? Like, what is the thing he's whispering to every single person in front of me? And then and eventually he begins to be able to hear something that the guy's whispering is like you made the cut, or you made the team, or something like that, or like you didn't make it, like you're out. And so then the producer starts wondering, like what, am I going to make the cut? Like, what's he going to say when he comes to me? And I don't even remember how it ends. I love the incredible amount of suspense and tension that is built in a very short span of time when almost nothing is happening whatsoever. It is as meaningless as a narrative possibly could get. And yet it feels like Hitchcock when you're actually listening to it. And so it is all about the investment of the emotional investment of the storyteller. If you really are made anxious or preoccupied by what's in front of you, if it keeps you up at night and makes your palms sweaty, then that's going to be really contagious to other people, regardless of whether it's quote unquote like high stakes or not.
Cool, thanks. All right, second question. What would you like to see this is from Susan Keatley. What would you like to see more of in science writing? What would you like to see less of? I know science writing is a general term here. What I mean is the body of science writing you read.
I'll jump in. It's I just love. I don't read a lot of serious science writing, stuff that's coming from the researchers, stuff that's answering a lot of basic research stuff. But I love anything with the sort of science of everyday life that gets out there. Reading a book now by what's the author, Ian Leslie, just called Curious. It's basically a book about the science of curiosity. And the evolution of curiosity, and why we came, why curiosity is so important, and why we have it, and most other animals, or I guess all other animals, do not. And it's a fascinating book. That was great. The Robert Wright's book, Why Buddhism is True, sort of looking at the science of, it's really the science of the brain, but relating it to 2,000-year-old philosophy and what they knew about the brain that modern science has proven. Michael Pollan's book on how to change your mind, another one that's just sort of everyday life. It's like how your brain works and how you process, but seen through the lens of experimenting with psychedelics, of psychotropic drugs. So I think anything that's pretty straightforward and simple, but just sort of pulls a layer back and dives in deep, I'm a sucker for.
And I think what I like reading and could use more of is writing about the process of science, the people doing it, and what they're learning right now, rather than, discoveries that have already been made. Although I also love the history of science and reading about often, some sort of forgotten people who made great discoveries, and they're sort of being rediscovered at this point.
I don't think this is the answer Susan was anticipating, but I would like to see more exclamation points. More. I just think they're so great. They're so great to be okay with announcing your enthusiasm for and your wonder and your fear and curiosity. Like, let that drive things. Maybe more question marks too.
How
Maybe
about
just more diversity of punctuation. generally.
tarot bangs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have anything, Shane?
Oops.
No. Yeah, I as like not a science writer, I'm actually really bad about this because I actually don't intake a lot of science. My life is so full of science that when it comes to actually like ingesting science, it's actually really tough. From the punctuation perspective, though, I appreciate a semicolon. I said it; it's out there. So we're just gonna let that land.
Ed Young wrote this really incredible essay for The Atlantic called "What Even Counts as Science Writing Anymore?" It was the introduction to the best science writing book, that the collection that came out. I'm just going to paste it in the chat because it was lovely. And it's just about how anything can really be science writing, because anything can be seen through a science lens. And so everybody should read that. So, all right, let's go to the next question, which is from Samantha Jones. Do you have a favorite science storyteller? Maybe someone who changed how you yourself tell stories?
I love this book called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Lowenhaupt Singh. And it's, if any of you haven't read it, it's a sort of like a cultural history of the Maitake mushroom, which was sparked by an urban legend she heard that it was the first above ground growth after the bombing of Hiroshima, I believe. And the feeling that inspired in her, which was, what can we as a species possibly learn from something that has survived so resiliently in such bleak times, and in such bleak circumstances? What can we take for those as we as a species enter into our own bleak circumstances? And it's essentially, it is a book length metaphor, right? It's a 300-page long metaphor in which she asks and tries again and again to answer that question. Can we take instruction and inspiration from the mushroom, and if so, how? And it reminds me of a couple things. It reminds me of Ishiguro, who once said every single one of his books is a single train of thought. And it's 500 pages in 5 years in order to fully articulate one single thought. And of David Lynch, who always talks about creativity as just sitting by the dark pool and waiting for the image to emerge from the depths, and all you do is catch it, and then you just chase after it for as long as you need to. And I really enjoy taking that approach to whatever work that I'm attached to as well.
Well, I'd like to mention a couple people. I've already mentioned Elizabeth Colbert, and Catherine Schultz is another New Yorker writer whose science I really love to read. But I would like to talk about Rachel Carson, who was very influential for me, earlier. Of course, Silent Spring, but it's actually her sea stories, the sea around us, and two others whose names I'm forgetting right now. about sea creatures that I found really inspiring and kind of taught me how to write about marine science in a storytelling kind of way.
Yeah, I mentioned it. I feel like Robert Wright and Michael Pollan. I'm not sure if they'd either be considered science writers, but they touch on science. Another one I'd mention is Amy Stewart, who writes a lot about gardening and botany, but she has a book called The Drunken Botanist, and she basically looks at all sorts of liquor and where it comes from. And her sort of revelation was leaving a liquor store when they looked up, and she realized I could name the genus and species of every one of these bottles, where it came from, whether it started with agave for tequila or corn for bourbon. And she ended up doing this great book to start looking at the botany of liquor. And again, it reflects back what I said earlier, what I'd like to see more of is sort of science of every day. It makes you rethink about stuff that you see every day and just assume you know about. You realize, oh, you don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And for me, it's frankly a couple of my colleagues I work with at Story Collider, my co-host here in DC, I mentioned earlier, Miriam Surinkalam, who is a scientist by training, who is just one of the most fantastic storytellers I've ever worked with, has told some of the most ridiculous, silly, frankly disgusting stories I've ever heard, and also some of the stories that have made me just weep on stage with her. So if you are in the DC area and she's telling a story, check that out. And then our ED at Story Collider, Aaron Barker, who is not a scientist by training, but runs the Story Collider now and has won the Moth Grand Slam a couple times, and is just such a wonderful human being. And so, yeah, I'm so fortunate to have a lot of contemporaries that I work with that I can work alongside, but also look up to as just phenomenal storytellers. So that's a really fortunate position to be in.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know I'm only the moderator and I'm not a panelist, but I want to answer this question anyway. Because one of my favorite story writers or science writers I've already mentioned is Ed Yong. And the very first time that I heard of him was his article called "No One is Prepared for Hagfish Slime," which is like the best title for an article anywhere. And the subtitle is, or like the little diddly underneath says, "It expands by 10,000 times in a fraction of a second. It's 100,000 times softer than Jell-O, and it fends off sharks and Priuses alike." So how could you not want to read that? I'm also going to paste that in the chat. So our last question comes from India, from Sana Saraju. She says, "Good morning from Bangalore, India. Big fan of Everwood here. Thank you for being up at 6:30 in the morning in Bangalore. This is amazing. My question is, as a writer editor, do you need to know your audience first to be able to craft a good story? Or do you consider a potential audience when just revising or improving a story? I ask this because I often define my audience as, quote, people who will be interested in this thing I am also interested in," end quote, and leave it at that.
Question. I don't want to go first.
At Orion, we think about like, again, sort of that self-consciousness about the object, like what is the point of bringing this physical thing into the world? And like, especially like we're an environmental magazine, which is kind of a contradiction because a magazine's a periodical. It's a, by definition, a disposable object. So, how do we turn it into something that you don't want to throw away the moment that you finished with it? And so we look for stories that will sort of foster a sense of mystery, so that you end up feeling as though there's more yet to be discovered, something that will reward revisiting several years down the road, that will make you want to keep it on the bookshelf for a little while and think like, maybe I'll get back to that later. And so when we think about audience expectations, we're thinking primarily of what can we do to make this something that will continue to add value to their lives eventually. It rarely gets into anything more projected than that, around their taste or anything like that. It's simply just how do we make sure that our work continues to feel relevant.
Yeah, if you can know your audience. Like any sort of communication, rule number one for us a lot of times is know who you're talking to try to tailor it. Sometimes it's not possible. So do your best. I mean, it's communication's a tricky thing, and you can gather as much data as you possibly can, but sometimes you just got to work with what you got. So yeah, if you can find that, do it. If you can't, that shouldn't prevent you from going out there and trying to tell really fun, compelling stories.
I tend to follow the rule, which is, I think it's taught a lot in schools, which is address it to one person. Try to find, like, I'll think I've got a friend, oh, they would probably subscribe to this magazine. They would probably be interested in this story. They don't know much about it. I'm going to write to her or to him. And that usually happens about the fourth day of my writing, and I get frustrated and it's not going well. I think if I find one person I'm writing to, then that can help. And hopefully if they fit the demographic generally.
And Sana, I think that your test of, writing for someone who's interested in the thing that you're interested in is a good one. I think if you try to address someone that you imagine who's not as interested as you are in it, then you're just gonna, put yourself into some kind of trouble. So stick with your enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's all the questions we have time for. I want to just give all of our panelists a last chance to give a shout out to anything that they're working on. If they have anything they want to pitch, last words.
I'll just say that Orion just released a book about bugs, and bugs have been on my mind because there was a centipede that ruined my life about an hour and 20 minutes ago. And it's called very directly The Book of Bugs. And it's the best writing about insects and spiders and other arthropods from 40 years of publishing. It's featuring like David Quammen, Robert McFarlane, Wendell Berry, lots of fascinating thinkers in there. Lulu Miller from Radiolab wrote the foreword to it. So that's a sweet little thing to check out in addition to the magazine as well.
And I'd just like to pitch the general idea that science is where it's at right now. If you look around, so much is happening in space, in our brains. There's so much to write about. And then I'll also just add a little pitch for the Johns Hopkins science writing program.
Yeah, I'll second the pitch on the Johns Hopkins program. I think it attracts great students. I know that. And I'll pitch a story I came out this week. I did on Vine Pair. I said in the introduction, I write a lot about spirits and cocktails. And I did a somewhat geeky piece on how acids, through the miracle of esterification, become wonderful things in a barrel over the course of 6 or 8 years of whiskey aging, which is a lot of geeky stuff. So that's, again, science of the everyday is always fascinating to me.
Yeah, and on my end, if you don't mind hearing a lot of this voice, you can subscribe to Third Pod from the Sun. I'll spell it out. That's the podcast that I produce and am co-host of. And if you're in the DC area, we're doing live shows for Story Collider. So actually next Thursday, so a week plus from today, Thursday, yeah, we have our last live show for the season. We're going to be outside on a patio at a bar here in DC. So yeah, if you're in the area, come check us out, come say hi. It'd be great to see y'all.
Great. And then I will pitch to everybody who is in the DC area, become a member of Duxwa, because we're awesome, and you get to do fun events that are in person. Like, we are going to be having our holiday party coming up soon, and we have Professional Development Day in the summertime or something, and just cool, more events like this. Yeah, so thank you to our panelists and to everybody who who is in our audience, and I hope that you learned something new and enjoyed yourself and had fun.
Thanks for the invite.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks,
Yes,
all.
Nice to meet everyone.
yes. Have a
Thank
great
you.
evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.